The silence in the house was a scream. Not a loud, piercing shriek, but a low guttural wail that resonated deep in my bones, vibrating through the floorboards, through the very air I breathed. It was the silence of absence, of something irrevocably gone. I stood in the sun-drenched living room, the dust motes dancing in the golden shafts of light, holding the crimson-bound photo album in trembling hands. My mother's handwriting, elegant and flowing, still graced the first page. Our family, a lifetime of love. But inside, where my face should have been, there was only a gaping, ragged hole. A meticulous surgical cut, precisely excising me from every single memory, every shared smile, every embrace. I flipped through the pages, a sickening lurch in my stomach with each turn. Birthday parties, summer vacations, Christmas mornings, my mother's radiant smile, my father's gentle eyes, but where my small eager face once beamed, now there was nothing but a void. It was as if I had never existed, a phantom limb of the family tree, severed without a trace. A cold anger, sharp and precise as the scissors that had done this heinous work, began to bloom in my chest. These weren't just photographs, they were tangible fragments of my past, anchors to a childhood I cherished, proof of a love that had shaped me. Now they were systematically obliterated, my very presence in those cherished moments deemed unworthy, disposable. The house, once a sanctuary filled with the echoes of laughter and my mother's melodious voice, now felt oppressive, a gilded cage where my history had been silently, ruthlessly erased. I, Alara, at 28, an artist who poured her soul into capturing the fleeting beauty of the world, found myself staring at a canvas of absence, a masterpiece of deletion. I had always felt a subtle disconnect with my father's new wife, Serafina, but this was an act of war. A declaration that my existence was an inconvenience to her meticulously crafted new reality. My mother, Clara, had been gone for 2 years, taken by a sudden cruel illness that had ripped through our lives like a tornado. The grief had been a heavy shroud, suffocating my father, Liam, a man who had always worn his heart on his sleeve. His sorrow had been profound, debilitating. Then, 6 months after the funeral, Serafina had appeared. A vision of elegant composure, a balm to my father's raw wounds. She was beautiful, with striking silver hair and eyes that seemed to hold both deep empathy and an unsettling, unreadable depth. She had moved into our lives with the quiet efficiency of a seasoned general, taking charge of the household, organizing Liam's life, and it seemed meticulously curating our past. The transition had been swift, almost jarring. Liam, desperate for comfort, for a semblance of normalcy, had clung to her. Their marriage, a whirlwind affair barely a year after my mother's death, felt less like a new beginning and more like a systematic erasure of the past, a quiet revolution orchestrated by Serafina. She had created what she called their new family, a perfect, polished tableau where no shadows of the past were allowed to linger. And it seemed I was the largest shadow of all. The photo album wasn't the first sign, merely the most blatant. The subtle eradication had begun almost immediately after Serafina moved in. My childhood room, a sanctuary filled with my mother's art supplies and the scent of old books, was redecorated without consultation. The vibrant blues and greens I loved were replaced with muted grays and creams, transforming it into a guest room that felt alien and unwelcoming. My mother's prized antique porcelain doll collection, which had sat proudly in the display cabinet for decades, was subtly misplaced, only to reappear months later in a dusty box in the attic deemed clutter. My suggestions for family outings, a hike on our favorite trail, a visit to the old independent cinema, were invariably met with Serafina's polite but firm redirection towards more suitable activities, usually involving her friends or events she had organized. Liam, ever agreeable, would simply nod, his eyes glazed with a kind of weary contentment, dismissing my growing unease as Serafina, making the house her own. "She's just trying to make us all comfortable, Ilara," he'd say, a gentle hand on my shoulder, oblivious to the subtle erosion of my identity within the very walls that had once cradled it. The photo album discovery wasn't a singular, isolated event. It was the chilling culmination of these smaller slights, a crescendo in the symphony of my gradual disappearance. I had stumbled upon it quite by accident, searching for a specific childhood picture of my mother and me by the lake, an image I wanted to use as inspiration for a new series of paintings. I had gone to the built-in bookshelves in the study, a place where the albums had always resided, neatly stacked. They were still there, but something felt off. The order was different, the labels on the spines newly printed. When I pulled out the crimson album, its weight felt wrong, too light. And then I opened it. The sight of my own excised image, replicated on page after page, had been a punch to the gut, stealing the air from my lungs. My initial reaction was a desperate need to confront Liam directly, to thrust the mutilated album into his hands and demand an explanation. But a wave of dread washed over me. I knew his dismissiveness, his tendency to avoid conflict, his habit of always siding with Serafina, who, with her carefully cultivated charm, could twist any narrative to her advantage. The potential for an explosive argument, one that would further fracture our already delicate family dynamic, paralyzed me. I closed the album, the silence in the room pressing down on me, heavy with unspoken accusations. Serafina's public persona was impeccable, a masterpiece of social grace. She volunteered at the local animal shelter, hosted elegant dinner parties for Liam's business associates, and spoke fondly, almost reverently, of my late mother, often sharing anecdotes that, while seemingly heartfelt, always managed to subtly highlight her own superior qualities. Clara was so wonderfully free-spirited, she'd coo. But perhaps a little disorganized, bless her heart. I've tried to bring a bit more order to Liam's life, just as she would have wanted. This carefully constructed facade made my growing unease seem irrational, even cruel. How could I accuse such a benevolent, grieving woman of something so petty, so malicious? It made it harder for me to articulate my feelings to others, or even to my father, who saw only her unwavering devotion and tireless efforts to make him happy. The subtle control escalated. Serafina started managing Liam's schedule with an iron fist wrapped in velvet. Old friends who had been constants in his life since college found their invitations to golf or poker nights mysteriously unreturned or rescheduled to inconvenient times. Even our weekly father-daughter dinners became subject to Serafina's approval, often cancelled or moved to accommodate her important engagements. She insisted on accompanying him everywhere, from business trips to casual errands, claiming to be protective of his health, of his peace of mind. "He needs his rest, Elara," she'd say, her voice laced with concern, her hand resting possessively on his arm. Liam, ever agreeable, ever the path of least resistance, went along with it, seemingly content in his gilded cage. He was a man who had always craved harmony, and Serafina provided it, albeit a harmony built on the suppression of anything that challenged her dominion. Then came the first crack in her perfect facade, a strange encounter that sent a tremor through my carefully constructed doubts. I was at a local gallery opening trying to lose myself in the vibrant chaos of abstract art, when I bumped into Aunt Clara. Not my mother Clara, but her older sister, Liam's sister, my actual Aunt Clara. She had been my mother's closest confidant, a second mother to me, and a fixture in our lives. But the woman standing before me was a shadow of her former self. She looked noticeably thinner, her usually lively eyes dulled, and her shoulders seemed permanently slumped. "Aunt Clara!" I exclaimed, genuinely surprised and delighted. "It's been ages. How are you?" She offered a weak smile, her gaze darting around the crowded room as if searching for an escape route. We exchanged pleasantries, and then hesitantly I asked, "Have you seen much of Dad and Serafina lately?" At the mention of Serafina's name, Aunt Clara's demeanor shifted dramatically. Her eyes widened almost imperceptibly, and a flicker of fear, or perhaps just profound discomfort, crossed her face. She became visibly tense, her hand unconsciously gripping the strap of her purse. She glanced around nervously, her gaze lingering on the entrance, as if expecting someone. "Oh, Elara, darling," she stammered, her voice unusually strained. I really must be going. I just remembered an urgent appointment." She quickly made her excuses, her words tumbling out in a rush, and practically fled the gallery, leaving me standing amidst the vibrant art with a profound sense of unease. Aunt Clara, who had always been so forthright, so grounded, had looked genuinely afraid. Her odd behavior sparked a new, unsettling line of inquiry for me. It was more than just the photos now. Something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. I couldn't shake Aunt Clara's reaction. It gnawed at me, a persistent itch I couldn't scratch. Her fear, her hurried departure, it wasn't typical Aunt Clara behavior. It was a catalyst. I decided then and there that I wouldn't be a passive observer in my own erasure any longer. My investigation began subtly, almost instinctively. I started with my mother's old diaries. Serafina had tidied them away shortly after moving in, claiming they were too painful for Liam to see. I had protested at the time, but Liam, lost in his grief, had agreed. I remembered Serafina placing them in a specific antique chest in the attic. Armed with a flashlight and a growing sense of dread, I climbed the creaky stairs. The chest was there just as I remembered, but instead of being neatly stacked, the diaries were haphazardly shoved inside, almost as if someone had been through them quickly. I pulled out the familiar leather-bound journals, their pages brittle with age, filled with my mother's elegant script. I spent hours poring over them, initially looking for clues about Serafina, but instead, I found something unexpected. Hidden within the mundane entries about daily life, tucked between recipes and garden notes, were coded passages. My mother, ever the lover of puzzles, had used a simple substitution cipher for things she wanted to keep private. It took me a full day, but I finally cracked it. The entries revealed a growing financial anxiety, concerns about a significant sum of money that had gone missing from a joint account she shared with Liam, money she had inherited from her own grandmother. She hadn't wanted to burden Liam with it, especially after his own business had hit a rough patch. But what truly chilled me were the later entries, penned just weeks before her death. They hinted at her suspicions about someone close to Liam, someone new in his life, someone who seemed to have an uncanny knowledge of their finances. The entries were vague, coded, but the underlying fear was palpable. My mother had been worried about Serafina. Armed with this unsettling information, I knew I had to press Aunt Clara. I called her, insisting we meet for coffee, choosing a small, out-of-the-way cafe where we wouldn't be overheard. She arrived looking even more fragile than before, her hands trembling as she held her teacup. "Aunt Clara," I began, my voice soft but firm, "I need you to tell me what you know about Serafina. My mother, she was worried about her." Aunt Clara's eyes welled up. She hesitated, glancing around the cafe. Then finally, with a deep sigh, she began to speak, her voice barely a whisper. "Your mother," she said. "She came to me just before she passed. She was terrified, Alara. She'd found out things about Serafina's past." My heart hammered against my ribs. "What things?" I urged. Aunt Clara recounted a chilling story. My mother, with her meticulous nature, had done some digging after noticing several odd discrepancies in their household finances and Liam's increasingly isolated behavior. She had discovered that Serafina had a history, a pattern, a string of short-lived marriages to wealthy, recently widowed men. All of them had died under vaguely natural circumstances, leaving their substantial estates to Serafina. Clara admitted she didn't know the full extent, but your mother had been convinced something was off, that Serafina was a predator. She was trying to gather proof, Alara, Aunt Clara whispered, tears streaming down her face. She was going to tell Liam, but then she got sick so quickly. One case, in particular, had involved a contentious will dispute that was eventually settled out of court, the details of which had been sealed. It was enough. The pieces of the puzzle began to click into place, forming a horrifying picture. I immediately launched into a deeper digital investigation. Using Serafina's maiden name, which Aunt Clara had reluctantly provided, I scoured old newspaper archives, public records, and obscure online forums. The internet, a vast ocean of information, slowly began to yield its secrets. I found it. A series of obituaries, each detailing the passing of a wealthy, elderly man, followed by a brief mention of his new wife, Serafina. The dates were staggered, the locations varied, but the pattern was undeniable. Then I found the contentious will dispute Aunt Clara had mentioned. A small article in a local paper from a decade ago, detailing a lawsuit filed by the children of a deceased millionaire against his new wife, Serafina. The case had been settled out of court, the terms undisclosed, but the implication was clear. Serafina was a black widow, a master manipulator, and my father was her latest target. The photo erasure wasn't just about petty jealousy. It was about systematically removing any trace of my mother, any competing claim to Liam's affections or assets, to solidify her control. Just as the full horror of my discovery was sinking in, just as I was steeling myself to confront Liam with the irrefutable proof, my phone rang. It was Serafina. My breath caught in my throat. Her voice, usually so composed and subtly condescending, was surprisingly warm, almost apologetic. "Elara, darling," she purred. "I've been doing some soul-searching. I've realized my actions regarding the photos were incredibly insensitive, thoughtless even. I've been under so much stress trying to manage everything, and I let my anxieties get the better of me. I truly want to make amends." My blood ran cold. This wasn't remorse. This was a calculated move. She was trying to control the narrative to neutralize me before I could expose her. "I've even managed to find all the original photos," she continued, her voice dripping with feigned sincerity. "I've had them beautifully restored, and I'd love for you to come over for dinner tonight. Just the three of us. A fresh start." I was wary, deeply so, but I agreed. I sensed a trap, a desperate attempt to regain control, but I also saw an opportunity. This was my chance to confront her, to watch her carefully constructed world crumble. Before I left, I called Aunt Clara. "I'm going to Dad's for dinner," I told her, my voice low. "Serafina called. She wants to make amends. If you don't hear from me by midnight, call the police." Aunt Clara gasped, but I hung up before she could protest. The new shift in perspective was chillingly clear. Serafina's sudden change of heart wasn't genuine remorse. It was a desperate, calculated maneuver. And I was walking right into it. The aroma of roasted lamb and fresh herbs filled the air as I stepped through the familiar front door, now feeling distinctly unfamiliar. Serafina, radiant in a silk dress, greeted me with a wide, almost too bright smile. "Elara, darling. So glad you could make it." Her embrace was fleeting, a performance for Liam, who appeared from the kitchen, a genuine relieved smile on his face. "Elara, it's so good to see you two getting along," he said, his voice thick with hope. The dining table was set impeccably, crystal gleaming under the soft light. Serafina had prepared an elaborate meal, a feast designed to convey warmth and reconciliation. Liam seemed genuinely happy, almost giddy with the apparent truce. After we had settled in and the initial pleasantries were exchanged, Serafina, with a flourish, presented me with a beautifully bound new photo album. It was a replica of the crimson one, but this one was pristine. "See, Elara," she said, her voice soft. "I've had all the photos professionally restored. Every single one. And I've even added some new ones of us as a family." I flipped through the pages. My excised face was indeed back, expertly reinserted, the edges seamless. There were even new photos carefully posed of the three of us, a picture of a perfectly happy blended family. She apologized profusely, almost convincingly, her eyes welling up with what looked like genuine tears. She spoke of her anxiety after my mother's passing, her misguided attempts to integrate into our lives, her deep regret for any pain she had caused. Liam, ever the empathetic soul, reached across the table to squeeze her hand, his gaze full of understanding. During dinner, I steered the conversation carefully, subtly. "You know, Serafina," I began, my voice casual. "I was going through some of my mother's old things recently. Her diaries, actually. She had such a unique way of looking at the world. She even had some coded entries which I finally managed to decipher. Fascinating stuff." Serafina's smile faltered, just for a fraction of a second. Her hand, which had been reaching for her wine glass, froze mid-air. "Oh, really?" she said, her voice a little too high. "Clara was always so private with her thoughts." I continued, weaving in details from the diaries, small anxieties about finances, a specific trip my mother had planned but never taken, details only someone intimately familiar with her would know. Serafina stiffened, her eyes narrowing almost imperceptibly. Then I brought up the photos, not with anger, but with a pained, almost bewildered curiosity. "It was so strange, Serafina," I said, my voice laced with a feigned vulnerability. "When I found those albums with my face cut out, it felt like such a profound act of something. I just couldn't understand why. It hurt deeply." Liam looked at me, his brow furrowed with concern. Serafina's perfect facade cracked, but not in the way I expected. She didn't lash out in anger. Instead, she became eerily calm, her eyes taking on a distant, almost vacant look. She took a deep breath, and then, in a voice that was barely a whisper, she admitted to cutting out the photos. "It was a desperate attempt, Elara," she said, her voice trembling, "to erase my own past trauma. You see, you reminded me so much of someone I lost. Someone who was taken from me violently. I was trying to erase the pain, to start fresh, to build a life with Liam free from the shadows of my own past. She then dramatically pushed up the sleeve of her dress, revealing a deep faded scar on her wrist, a jagged line that spoke of old wounds. This, she said, her voice thick with emotion, is from a past abusive relationship. I was trying to erase myself from that life, and in my desperation I projected it onto you. It was a subconscious act, a misguided attempt to heal. Liam, ever empathetic, ever the man who sought to soothe pain, fell for it hook, line and sinker. His face softened with pity. He immediately went to Serafina, pulling her into a comforting embrace. "Oh, my love," he murmured, stroking her hair. He then turned to me, his eyes filled with disappointment. "Ilara," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "how could you be so insensitive? Serafina has been through so much. She's trying to heal. This is her way of coping." He was chastising me, defending her, completely blind to the calculated manipulation unfolding before his eyes. The twist was devastating. Her confession wasn't a moment of truth, but another layer of deceit, designed to evoke sympathy and turn Liam against me. But I was not fooled. My plan was already in motion. Just as Liam was consoling Serafina, just as she was basking in his misplaced sympathy, the doorbell chimed. A polite, insistent ring. Serafina frowned, a flicker of annoyance crossing her face. "Who could that be?" she murmured. Liam, still holding her, went to the door. Standing on the porch were two figures, a stern-faced woman in a dark suit, clutching a briefcase, and to my father's utter shock, two uniformed police officers. "Mr. Davies?" the woman asked, her voice crisp and professional. "I'm Ms. Reynolds, legal counsel. We have a warrant for Ms. Serafina Davies." Liam looked from Ms. Reynolds to the police officers, then back to Serafina, his face a mask of utter bewilderment. Serafina's composure, which had been so meticulously maintained, shattered like fragile glass. Her eyes, which moments before had held feigned tears, now widened in raw terror. The color drained from her face, leaving her ashen. The karma wasn't a sudden dramatic outburst, but the slow, methodical unraveling of her carefully constructed lies, the re-emergence of a hidden past she had so desperately tried to bury. Ms. Reynolds stepped forward, her gaze fixed on Serafina. "Ms. Davies, we are here to serve you with papers related to a reinvestigation into the death of Mr. Arthur Sterling, your former husband. New evidence has come to light. My anonymous tip, combined with the initial re-evaluation of that contentious will dispute, had finally borne fruit." The police stepped inside, their presence filling the room with an undeniable gravity. Liam watched in stunned horror as the full extent of Serafina's deception began to unfold before his eyes. The woman he had loved, the woman he had married, was a stranger, a predator, her every action a calculated step in a long dark game. The silence in the house, once a scream of my own erasure, now echoed with the shattering of his world. Serafina was taken for questioning, her protests weak and unconvincing against the cold, hard facts presented by Ms. Reynolds. Liam stood rooted to the spot, his face pale and drawn, the vibrant colors of the dinner party now seeming garish and out of place. He was devastated, not just by the betrayal of the woman he had loved, but by the profound shock of realizing his own unwitting complicity, his blindness. The man who had always sought harmony was now adrift in a sea of discord, his heart broken by the deception and by the realization of how deeply he had been manipulated. In the days and weeks that followed, the house became a tomb of silence once more, but this time it was a silence of grief and processing, not of erasure. Serafina's past was laid bare in the news, a chilling pattern of calculated marriages and suspicious deaths. The police investigation widened, and it became clear that her change of heart had been a desperate attempt to preempt my exposure of her. Ilara, though still reeling from the emotional whiplash, found a new, albeit painful, common ground with her father. The shared trauma, the raw wound of betrayal, forced them to confront difficult truths about themselves and each other. We spent hours talking not about Serafina but about my mother, about Liam's grief, about my own feelings of abandonment. The restored photo albums, once a symbol of her deceit, now became a testament to our resilience. a visual narrative of a past that could no longer be erased. They were no longer just pictures. They were anchors, pulling us back to a shared history that Serafina had tried to sever. The house, once filled with the oppressive atmosphere Serafina had created, began to feel lighter, as if a heavy shroud had been lifted. Alara found solace in her art, channeling her experiences into new, powerful pieces that explored themes of visibility, memory, and the hidden truths beneath polished surfaces. Liam, however, struggled deeply with guilt and self-blame. He had been so trusting, so desperate for comfort, that he had allowed himself to be blind. It was a painful lesson, one that would take time to process. Eventually, Liam made a difficult decision. He sold the large, echoing house, a place that now held too many ghosts and too many painful memories. He moved into a smaller, cozier place closer to my apartment. It was a quiet acknowledgement of his need to rebuild, to reconnect with the only family he truly had left. We began the slow, arduous process of genuinely reconnecting, attending therapy together, peeling back the layers of hurt and misunderstanding that had accumulated over the years. The photo albums, once a source of profound pain, became a testament to our resilience, a symbol of the enduring power of genuine family bonds, no longer defined by absence, but by presence, by truth, and by the love that had always been there, waiting to be rediscovered. What does it truly take to see the truth when it's hidden behind the people we love? And how do we heal the damage left behind?